Welcome to grant writing. Let's talk a little bit about how and what we do in writing a grant. So we'll also talk about different types of grants and then just kind of a basic review of the process. Grants are about ideas, and we have lots and lots of ideas that we'd like to make into reality, whether it's some kind of a program to reduce type 2 diabetes or texting while driving. We all have these different ideas, and the purpose of a grant is to give you funding so that you can make those ideas become reality. So, but the problem is that translating ideas from just some mental conception to an actual plan requires money and support from important stakeholders. So, for instance, if I want to implement a new treatment to help low-income individuals get fed during the coronavirus, I have to have first I have to have money to buy food, and then I have to have support from the stakeholders to deliver the food to the people who need it the most. So you need support from the stakeholders, but you also need grant money. To get support from the stakeholders, you need to be good at negotiating with people, and you have to be good at making friends in high places, as they say. But you really have to be good at selling your ideas to others. A lot of people will want to, a lot of foundations or other groups will want to join forces with you if you're proposing a grant that'll fund them, of course, because they need money. But if you fail to deliver, then they may not want to team up with you again. In terms of grants, we have private and public sources for grants. The government is the public. We'll talk about that in a second. But under the private sources, there are different foundations. One of them is the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which is out of New Jersey, actually. And they do a lot of funding in public health. Prevent Cancer Foundation, that's just one example, because I've had some success with that foundation getting grant funding. The Ford Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is primarily interested in infectious diseases. So right now, you see Bill Gates is in the news a lot because of the coronavirus. For public grants, there are a variety of sources. I'm going to focus on the National Institutes of Health because those are so in the if you were to compare all the different granting sources and say which is the most important of all, I'd probably say, especially in public health, the National Institutes of Health are at the peak. And if you have any pretensions of becoming a good researcher, you have to be able to get National Institutes of Health grants, NIH, so institutes, so there's more than one institute. NIH is part of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, so again, as I said, it's the institutes. There's 27 institutes and centers. So some of them, for instance, are the National Cancer Institute. That's the one that provides the most money because cancer is still, obviously a critical issue. A lot of the funding for disease research comes from the demographics of our politicians. So you have a lot of males and females who are older, so breast cancer, and in men, prostate cancer are heavily funded because of what our demographics of our politicians are. Other ones are NIDA, the National Institute of Drug Abuse, this Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. So there's a lot of different ones. One that might interest some of us is the National Institutes of Minority Health and Health Disparities. Each of these groups are part of NIH. When one applies for an NIH grant, one tends to target grants that are specific to those or specific to those agencies or those centers or institutes. Now, there's different types of NIH grants. Well, the grant opportunities that are offered are amazing. Now, first of all, they're very competitive. You can't just say, well, I want to get one of these grants. I'd like you to be able to say that, but you have to be able to get them. So we'll get to that part. That's what this course is about, giving you these tools to achieve that. But in terms of the types of different grants, we have grants that are supplements to existing grants. So for instance, if you know somebody who has a grant, you can write a supplement. And that's a really good way to start to get into the grant writing. So it's not necessarily it's going to be your grant, it's going to be the primary investigator's grant, but you get your feet wet. That's actually how I started. So there's things like minority supplements, which are 2-year grants worth about $40,000. They may go up and down from year to year. It gives you money for study to complete whatever project you're doing, plus money for travel, etc. Training grants are awesome, and small grants like the R03 is really good too. So there's all these grants have a specific title. The R01, which is like the most coveted of all the grants in NIH. The R01 is a 5-year grant. It's usually in the millions of dollars. Why these are important is because by having one of these grants, you become basically like a business or an employer in your community, and you employ people to work for you. Like one of the grants I'm working on right now, which is about to be finished, and has employed about 4 or 5 people for the last 5 years. I mean, that's really good, and at a substantial income. So there's really a lot of benefits to these. But there's a variety type of grants, like the exploratory grants, the R21. Like say, I have this idea, but I'm not really sure if it's going to work. And I'm not so sure it could be accepted as an R01, a major grant. So let's try it with this R21 mechanism. I think this lasts about 2 years. R21s. Now the interesting thing is that through NIH one can actually have a very long career as a student and as a researcher. Like for instance, let's say you decide I want to get my doctorate. You get your PhD, and then you move on into what's called a postdoctoral fellowship, which is another 2-year program where you're actually learning to become a researcher. And during that postdoc, you could apply for like a supplement of some sort, supplementary grant. After that's done, you can apply for a K award, which is a training grant. I had it on the past slide. And those will fund you for several more years of learning, and they prepare you to become a researcher who can get these R01 grants. So this process, you can actually be a student. If you think a PhD program is about 5 years, a postdoc's another 2, so that's 7. One of these K awards, you're talking about, I think it's like 3, 4 more years, maybe even 5 years. I mean, you're kind of like a student, but you're making a lot of money during that time too. So it's not, even as a PhD student, you earn income. So you earn income in addition to having your tuition paid for. You earn, probably depends on which school you go to, anywhere from $20,000 to $30,000+ a year. This is just being a student. So it's interesting. So they're a way to prolong your learning and keep you excited for a while. I love doing these grants. I also like teaching, so I'm not just doing those, but I like doing these grants. The problem is, of course, NIH grants are very difficult to get. The biggest predictor of getting a grant is having received one already. So as you can imagine, it's really hard to get a grant right away. So you have to actually work your way up to it. The best way to do that is to work for somebody who knows what they're doing. Like working, say, at a university that receives a lot of grant funding would be very helpful. Like I worked at Penn. I was a postdoc at Penn, and I worked with a seasoned researcher who was able to give me the right opportunities to learn how to write grants. And then I worked at Brown, which also with another seasoned investigator who was very successful. So when you link up with these individuals, you learn how to write grants, and then you later can move on into writing your own grants. The best way to start is something like I said, maybe doing a grant supplement or one of those K award grants, or then moving into higher levels of grant writing. There are other federal agencies that provide grant funding. For instance, the Department of State, the CDC, the Department of Education. There's multiple other organizations. The best way to find those is going to grants.gov. That's where you find all the great grant information. All right, let's get back to how does it start? So you visualize your idea first. That's the most important thing. Imagine what the idea would look like in reality. what would be your variables and how would it measure? You start with, of course, with a research question of some sort. How would you take, how long would it take to conduct your entire study? Where would you collect the data? All this information should be running to your head. This is my favorite part of the grant writing process, because this is actually where you have all the creativity. Then the next thing you have to do is identify the funding source. Now, grant funders either solicit proposals to meet specific research questions, or they have what are called unsolicited grant opportunities. But unsolicited grant opportunities are like this umbrella term under which you can like apply for whatever idea you want, as long as it fits under the under the umbrella term. So in terms of applying your grant, you really need some organizational support. Like if you're working at LaSalle has a grant office where somebody can help you through this, because the whole process of applying for a grant is very complicated and includes a lot of steps, and it's beyond what I can do personally. So it's important to have others to help you with that. In addition, so there are some grants, like I see this a lot with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, where you get this, you have to write a letter of intent specifying what the grant idea is, and it goes through some kind of a vetting, and then certain people are invited to apply for the grant. But the important thing is that you have to read through the grant information, and all these agencies publish these different, whatever the requirements are for applying for the grant. Like in our grant idea or our grant for this course, the one that you're applying for, it has very specific rules to it. So you have to follow those specific rules in order to get the grant. So let's say if you were to write a letter of intent and you passed, then you'd be ready to go and actually write the grant. But beware of deadlines. All grants have very specific deadlines. And that's not only do the grantors have deadlines, but so do the institution. So like, let's say you find a really cool grant and it's due in a week, and you say, oh, I can do this, this is easy. But your institution may require a lot of time, like maybe a month or 2 weeks for it to go through the institutional processes. If you don't take that into account, you won't be able to write the grant. And then also sometimes grant offices will not allow you to apply for the grant for other reasons. Perhaps they're too busy. The grant doesn't fit in what the institution wants. So there's a lot to take care of. So you can't just say, I'm going to write a grant. In my basement, I'm going to conduct this experiment. It doesn't work that way. Okay, so now say you have your idea, you have your grant mechanism to which you're going to apply, you understand all the deadlines, you've passed all the preliminary stages, and you're ready to write. But important thing is that you have the idea, go out and read the literature. This is probably the most important part of the grant. And when we talk about learning to write like a scholar, I talked about how you read the literature and then you write. Well, this is the stage where you start reading the literature. Reading literature is an interesting process, and there is a really good way to do it that would actually save you a lot of time. I'm going to pause this for a second. I paused because I just wanted to get an article to show you what I'm talking about here. So here's an article, An Association Between Adolescent Blunt Use and the Uptake of Cigars. So this is an article that I was involved in as a statistician. So I can just read through the abstract and get the main idea. So I can, as I'm shopping for an article, say, does this article apply to what I want to do? Okay, it does. So now what do I do next? Well, if I'm in a hurry and I only need to know, does the article support or detract from what I'm interested in, after I've written, I can just look at the results here and figure out what's going on. But that's in the earliest stages. I need to just kind of get a reading of the article. If I know nothing about blunts and cigars, I'd probably read the entire introduction, because the introduction, actually, if you look at the cites, it's citing different sources. By the way, this is what a superscripted source looks like. Notice how it's right after the punctuation. So this is what I'm expecting for our grant. So if you're looking at these, you'll say, okay, I got some additional sources that I can read. But what am I looking for here? So the way this article is set up, and we'll talk about this later, is that it builds up to the research question. So I'll probably find what I'm looking for in this last paragraph. This cross-sectional research has documented the co-use of blunts and cigars among adolescents. However, to our knowledge, whether blunt use is associated with cigar uptake and escalation in the frequency of cigar use has not yet been investigated, or has yet to be investigated. See, this author, this is one of my colleagues, does a really good job at setting up the question. She read through the literature herself and says, however, this isn't being done. So this is what we're going to do here. So this is where you find what's going on, and then you go to the results section. And in the results section, you'll find where, obviously, the results are, what you're looking for. This is where the results are that are unobstructed by the opinions of the authors. See, when you go into the discussion, you get the author's opinions here, and you get a lot of blah blah stuff here. So that's why I tend to focus on when I'm reading articles, title, obviously. The abstract helps me to identify whether the article is worth reading or not. I go straight to that last paragraph, unless I know nothing about the area at all, because I can find good sources here. Go here to see what the intent of the article, of the manuscript or study is. Read the results section, and now if my study aims to understand something, and I need to poke holes in the studies being done so far, then I'll do a deeper look at, for instance, how items were measured, what measures were used to access cigar use, for instance. That happens too, because if my idea is closely aligned to other ideas, then I got to find ways to differentiate mine from those, and that's where I would appeal to a more fine-grained analysis of the article. For instance, like, how did they approach measuring cigar use? Okay, so one thing you can get from the literature is, like, after you have your idea, is first of all, you can see what's been done already. So if everybody's done what you're done, then what you're planning to do, then it's not worth doing. In grants, people want novelty. They don't want you to do what's been done before. But you can also refine your ideas, because maybe you'll find something new that hasn't been done yet. So that all the authors are talking about. So you might actually refine your idea. All right, so in writing the grant, so I'm just going to go over this in brief, because we're going to talk about this obviously in much more detail. And I kind of mentioned this already in the beginning when we talked about my grant, is that you have to, whatever the grantor is looking for, or whatever their mission is, you have to make sure you include that within the grant itself. And then also be aware of the amount of funding that's available and the timeline for the grant, because you have to fit your study within that. We'll talk about that much more later, but you can't, you say if the grant's 5 years, you can't say I'm going to start collecting data day 1 and end collecting data day 5 at the end of year 5. That won't work, because you need time to write up the grant results and disseminate the information. All right, so let's look at the research plan. So this is what you need. You need title, abstract, statement of the research plan, its significance. Why is this considered a significant problem? Well, like, for instance, with coronavirus, we could say it's significant because a lot of people are dying. Is it innovative? My idea. Like, if I propose a new drug that'll actually cure the coronavirus, I think that's very innovative. The method, the literature cited, and the documentation of informed consent, all of these have to be part of your grant. And when grants are scored, and grants do get scored by reviewers, they're usually scored on areas like your approach. Approaches includes like your methods, statistical analysis, data collection plan, who your participants and procedures are. They're also scored on significance and innovation. So they're scored on a variety of different things. Sometimes they're scored on your budget, like the grants that I've been reviewing for the European Union. The budget and how the monies are allocated is is important. But when you write a grant, you also need to take care of that part, the budget, for instance. You also have to discuss the resources and the environment. And this is an issue for us here at LaSalle when we try to compete with institutions like Penn and Temple in the Philadelphia area that are big grant receivers. People will look at them and say, well, they have a better environment than we do and more resources available because, hey, they do it all the time. You have to be smart about how you write those sections. I've been very successful here, even at LaSalle, at writing those to make sure we get funded. Titles are very important. Titles for grants have to be written in a very condensed but very accurate and very telling manner. For instance, here, high density association analysis of lung cancer. So these are all titles that I found in the NIH report. So you have links to all these in this. I'm going to obviously post this to your files. Altering nicotine reward through conditioning. See, all those are very telling, very concise titles. You have to write abstracts. There's generally two different types of abstracts that you have to write, but there's a layperson's abstract and a technical abstract. The layperson abstract is an abstract for the general public, and especially when you're dealing with foundations rather than government sources. And foundations, people reading your abstract might know nothing about the science, but they just want to give away money. So you want to make sure that you can speak in language that fits their understanding. Then, of course, there's a technical abstract, which is for other people like yourself. In some cases, the abstract is the only thing a person's going to read. So imagine the person has a lot of money, is very busy, so they'll just read your abstract and nothing else. You better do a really, really good job describing it. So the specific aim section is the first part of the grant. And this is where you detail. It's almost like doing a little grant, a grant in miniature. Actually, for instance, if you look at this article that I brought it here, the first part of this article is a lot like the specific aim section of a grant. Right here. Let's see, where does it start? The introduction. Because a specific aim section is basically an introduction followed by the research question. So like here, the research question is embedded in this last paragraph, right? So this is what's called a brief report format in a paper. Because you see, there's not a lot of an introduction. It's several paragraphs, maybe 2 paragraphs long, or 3 paragraphs. This reads kind of like a specific aim section. So you go through what the issue is. You always start by discussing the epidemiology of the issue. Like here, you see that the epidemiology of blunt use is discussed. The estimates suggest that 12 to 19% of adolescents have smoked a blunt in the past month. So this is where you do the epidemiology, and then you go through what's been done so far and what's missing. So you're trying to set up your study, and then at the end you introduce what's called the research question, and then you introduce the hypotheses. All of these things we'll discuss as we move forward in much more detail. But you add what are the aims of the study. These are called specific aims. You may have one aim, you may have 2 aims. Like one aim may be to better understand the epidemiology of blunt use in African Americans, or to understand the epidemiology of blunt use in Hispanic males ages 18 to 22, etc. So you add those specific. That's one specific aim. Maybe a second specific aim would be to test whether there are differences by income in blunt use in Hispanic males. So you can add as many research questions as you like, but you should try to limit it, because a messy grant is a grant that asks too many questions. A good grant is one that doesn't ask too many questions. It's very, very well thought out, very reasoned, and very focused. So you can lose points in grant writing if you're not very focused. But excuse me. it's important to note that a grant is about selling an idea. And that's the most important thing. So if you think, like I knew this one researcher, and I do know this one researcher, I still work for her. When she started writing grants, she was just writing these like amazingly technical theses about whatever she was interested in studying, and like, wow, I'd get so bored reading them. I mean, unless I like reading statistics, but some stuff doesn't interest me as much. A good grant writer doesn't bore the reader. A good grant writer writes so that the reader stays excited and interested. And if you get into too much detail, you're not going to sell your idea. So the idea is to sell the idea to the buyer. Think about yourself as being a salesperson and you're trying to sell a new car to somebody. There's a lot of cars out there, and why should I buy that one? Well, you better do a good job at selling it to me. This is what your job is here. You're selling the grant to me. So in terms of significance in innovation, you have to tell me why this is a significant issue. Like I mentioned earlier with coronavirus, it's easy because we have had nearly 100,000 deaths already. That's an easy way to paint something that's significant. However, if everybody's doing that, you got to find something else that's making this significant. You could say something like, finding a cure for the coronavirus may help us find cures for other infections so we don't lose jobs in the future from another pandemic or something like that. It's always good to have a theoretical perspective for your grant. Now, in teaching this course, this has been an area that's been difficult for students to understand. How do I blend my theoretical perspective with what I'm doing to make it not look obvious that I'm just adding a theoretical perspective in there? That happens a lot. Like I like using the bioecological model. And when I do that, I always start with a statement that the theory that guides variable selection is something like the bioecological model. But then as I'm writing my background information, even going back to the specific aim section, I'm linking everything to that theory so that it's obvious that that's what's being done without always saying that this is linked to that theory. You have to be able to use the theory to help you write, but don't make it so obvious. Like, this is part of the theory, this is part of, just say consistent with the bioecological model, we believe blah, blah, blah. Or we chose these variables because they're consistent with this facet of the bioecological model. In terms of making something innovative, you have to show why your project is different from what's being done, what has been done before. By the way, if you decide to go to a doctoral program and you have to do a PhD dissertation or DRPH dissertation, your dissertation is a proposal. It starts with a proposal, so it's a lot like the grant proposal. And your idea has to be innovative, otherwise it will not pass the smell test with your reviewers. And you have reviewers with doctoral dissertations as well. In writing the methods, we focus on who our participants are, and just like any paper, participants, procedures, and data analysis plan. The choice of participants is very, very important. First of all, you have to ensure power. So you have to make sure that you have the ability to reject a false null hypothesis. Taking stats with me, and I know there's an undergrad in the course, but taking stats with me at the master's level, we go through calculating power. Calculating power is key. Power here means the ability to reject a false null hypothesis, and that the main way to gain power is to have a large sample size. The larger the sample size, the better. With grants, though, everything costs money, so the problem is that having a large sample size is very expensive. So you have to figure out, how do I balance sample size, need for a larger sample size with the amount of money I have? And that's what a power analysis does. We set the probability of rejecting a false null hypothesis at 0.8. Not at 100%, but at 0.8. That's where we use software such as G-Power in order to find what's the minimum sample size I need to conduct a study so I can have sufficient power, and that's what we do. Okay, and then that's probably the key part of grant writing, is being able to do the power analysis. Also, the statistical methods you use are very important. All the measures that you use, like for instance, if you're collecting data, and we collect a lot of data on substance use. So when I'm collecting data on substance use, my questions have to be designed well. They have to be valid, reliable. So you have to go through the literature and make sure that the measures you use are valid and reliable. If you're using a new measure that's never been used before, then you need to pilot it. That means you have to test it. Like we've done this in the past. When we had a new measure, we just go, like when I was at UPenn, I'd go into the cafeteria and ask students, will you complete this? Here's a gift card for $5 or something. And they completed, and that got me pilot data. Procedures are more detailed in terms of what's the roadmap look like for me collecting data. Like, what do I have to do? Well, usually you have to get informed consent, obviously. So this is something that needs to be done through your institution, through your institutional IRB, institutional review board. So you see there's a lot of planning involved. Some of our students in our capstone here in a master's level decide, I want to do a project where I'm going to collect data, but they don't realize that the collecting data you need to get IRB approval, and that can be time consuming. Well, when you're applying for the grant, you don't necessarily need the IRB approval in advance, but you can say you're going to get IRB approval. But before you start collecting data, you need IRB approval. What you'll have to do, though, is make sure that you would not fail the IRB smell test. So it means you have to design your study in a way that it will guarantee IRB approval. So you can't do anything that harms the participants in any way. Everything has to be considered in your procedures, how much money you'll give people if you're giving money. And in most studies these days, people want money, otherwise they won't do them. So that's an incentive, and when you give money to people, you can't be coercive. So you have to make sure that the amount of money given is not considered coercive in any way. Checking how we're doing with time here. Speaking of time, we have timelines in our grant, and these are very key because this shows you how long everything's going to be taking and when you plan to do it. Like in this timeline, we're going to refine the measures and procedures in the first 2 months, develop the database and tracking system. After that, do our assessments all the way through here, do cohort maintenance and manuscript prep. Notice so this is a 2-year grant because it's 24 months. You notice from 19 to 24, there's no more data collection. So this is time that needs to be used to wrap things up and write manuscripts and stuff like that. So this is set up to be very feasible. One thing that grants are reviewed on, one factor is feasibility. So if somebody looks at this, say, well, they're going to collect 100 folks, surveys, they've got all the institutional support they need from internally, stakeholders are buying in. And to get, by the way, when you ask people to allow you to collect data, like for instance, we used to collect data in schools a lot, we have to get letters of support from the superintendent saying that they will allow us, otherwise we won't be considered as a serious contender for the grant. And somebody will look at this and say, okay, this can be done. That's feasibility. If you fail this feasibility test, you're not going to get the grant. There's a lot of tests, aren't there? Data analysis, you just talk about what you're going to do. If you use a very simple data analysis plan, then you don't really have to use as much, but you always have to justify what you're doing. Like I was just completing an analysis now for one of our studies that I'm working on, and I had to use a different analysis method than I thought I would, and I justified why I used it, even in writing a manuscript, because I know there's people out there who are out to get you, right, to make sure that you don't get the money. That's a key is in grant writing, is there's going to be somebody that you have to please out there, and that's a reviewer. Reviewers are always out to make you look bad. It's their job. So if they find anything that's nasty in your grant, they'll get you for it. So be careful with your statistical analysis plan. If you choose something that's very complicated, then you need to explain it really well. If you don't, then you won't need to explain as much. Like if say I'm doing a linear regression analysis, here's my predictors, here's my outcome, I'm going to check it for the assumptions, boom, that's it. But if I'm doing something like structural equation modeling, then I have to spend more time explaining what's going on. I already discussed the IRB a little bit. And I'll talk a little bit of budget justifications. Everything in your budget has to be justified. Everything. So you have to do, it's like you're an accountant and you have to make sure that everything is good in terms of how much money you're going to spend, but you also have to justify why everybody's getting what they're getting. And by the way, the researchers do get paid, and in institutions like UPenn and Temple, where people are on actually a research track, their entire salary is paid for by grants. Institutions maybe give a little, but not a lot. Maybe they'll cover 5% of one's salary. 5%, nothing more. The rest has to be up to you. But institutions like those big ones, they don't like it when 100% of your salary comes from one grant. They want you to mix it up. So they'll say you can have no more than 20% of your salary from one grant. So you need to be on, well, to get 100% coverage, you'd have to be on 5 grants. So you have to be aware of all this information. I talked about resources and environment. Finally, in terms of personnel, everybody has to be justified as well. You have to provide what's known as a biosketch. A biosketch is a short version of what's called a CV, a curriculum vitae. In academics, we have curriculum vitae rather than resumes. The beauty of a curriculum vitae or CV is that it can be really long. Longer the better, whereas with a resume, shorter is better. You have to talk about what everybody's doing within the grant and justify them. I would say one thing though, if you don't like doing stats, always hire a biostatistician. And often we also hire consultants. Like say if I'm writing a grant about cigar use, I'm not a cigar use researcher, but I know some really good cigar use researchers. I might hire them as consultants. All of those things will make the grant look better. So the idea here is to sell your idea so that your grantors will buy it. And if they buy it, you get the grant. If they don't buy it, you don't get the grant. It's simple, but for some institutions, you require this funding in order to survive. So get good at grant writing. And that's what we're going to do this semester, all right? Thanks. Bye.